that normal professionalism or polish that we normally have, and just deal with me. But yeah, we're going to talk about today's events. A lot of stuff going on. We've had a pretty big win today from Ohio State over Michigan State. That's one that we kind of called. At least I called it to be a blowout. We can talk about that a little bit. We'll get into the afternoon events, particularly Alabama's close game against Arkansas, probably the biggest one of the afternoon. And then tonight, you've had a couple big ones. You've got Oregon currently losing big to Utah, and you have what looks to be South Carolina, I guess, upsetting Auburn. It seems to be the next biggest one of the day. Not a huge day, so we probably won't go too long today. But yeah, that's what's on docket. And, let's keep moving. All right. So without further ado, I think the biggest event of the day has to be really, well, if it's not this not this Oregon loss, it of the completed games, it was Ohio State's beat down over Michigan State. And look, there's a couple things you can take away from that game. The first one is the dominance that Ohio State showed offensively. But look, I mean, when we did our previews, I was pretty blunt that I felt like Ohio State could name whatever number they wanted to name. And I thought it was more just a matter of how many points Ohio State felt like they needed to score in order to win the game. And I thought, they might end up being somewhere around like 50 to 60 points, but I really thought that, that was going to be because Michigan State was going to put up maybe 35 points in a game, 30, 35 points. Ohio State's defense has shown some chinks. I felt like Michigan State's offense had shown the ability to move the ball at times. Now, there were some complications there, right? Like Naylor's out of the game, and Michigan State had injuries. But I think the absolute takeaway is Ohio State's defense is starting to play at a very high level. Because, again, 130th in the country in total yards passing defense. And we're not a total yardage stat, but you've got to take something away from the fact that they really haven't prevented anyone from throwing the ball all year. So I fully expected Ohio State to throw the ball for the yardage they did. I just didn't expect Ohio State to shut down Michigan State to such an extreme extent. And that snowballs, right? Because if the other team can't move the ball, then you get the ball, and Ohio State starts to dominate. And like our model said it was going to be a blowout. Daniel thought it'd be a blowout. I thought it was going to be even worse blowout than the model, and all of that really wasn't quite in line with the level of blowout that we got. Stephen Light, thanks for the super chat. Always appreciated, saying yay, another day of crazy college football. Kiltack is go ahead and put his super chat down. We'll get to that Alabama game in a minute. But the question, Alex Rydell just posed, right? Is Ohio State's defense good yet? And I think the answer is yes. I don't think you can ever take away from a game like that, Ohio State-Michigan State game, anything but the fact that Ohio State was dominant. It is very difficult to dominate anyone defensively in college football today, or at least anyone with a decent amount of talent. Peyton Thorne was 4.4 yards per attempt, 14 to 36 passing. That's not even 50% passing. 4.4 yards per attempt is dismal. And rushing, Elijah Collins had a couple big runs, but other than that, Kenneth Walker, 6 carries for 25 yards. And, look, I think you can be critical of the fact that Michigan State never committed to the run in any way. I mean, Walker did have 4.2 yards per carry, but the reality is that Ohio State's offense is such a snowstorm. 6 touchdown passes for CJ Stroud, 32 of 35 passing, 432 yards. It puts the defense in a precarious position. And the thing that Ohio State is doing that Alabama, for example, didn't do is they put the game away. I mean, Ohio State got on that immediately. They were scoring touchdowns from the jump, scoring touchdowns consistently. That puts a tremendous amount of strain on the opposing defense to be able to contain it, to be able to be aggressive because you're in a big hole, and then the opposing offense has to get away from what they're doing in order for them to be able to just stay on the field. So yeah, I think absolutely you have to take away the fact that Ohio State's defense is legit. And I think at this point in the season, I mean, I don't even know what to say about it, right? I think the biggest thing though at least in my mind, is they found ways to generate disruption defensively, to generate sacks and tackles for loss. Garrett showed up, Tyreek Smith showed up, and when you're starting to get production out of guys like Eichenberg and Williams on a consistent basis, that defense has a chance to be a lot more successful long term. So because of all that, yeah, I mean, Ohio State's performance was extremely impressive. It doesn't really change my take on Ohio State offensively that much. Now, bear in mind, I had Ohio State in ahead of Alabama in my top 10 last week. So it's not like I'm dinging Ohio State by saying it doesn't change my viewpoint. I knew Ohio State was elite offensively going into it. But whatever concerns I had, Michigan State is not the right team to challenge the inconsistencies that Ohio State has shown in the passing game against teams that can cover well and disrupt. But the thing that was impressive was just how much Ohio State defensively took Michigan State to task in a way that, for example, Michigan absolutely couldn't do. And that really, to me, shows that not only are they class of the Big Ten, but they're one of the best teams in one of the best positions to be able to, go into the playoffs and win a playoff game. I'm just going to move on with our game summaries right now. I know there's a lot of talk. I mean, people talking about like changing coordinators and things. Yeah, I mean, I think Ohio State's change of coordinator has been a big impact. They weren't confused by a lot of the RPO stuff, but they did seem to be, they seem to be on top of it for the first time, I would say, in a long time. And I will say, guys, some of you guys in the chat are really going at each other. Try not to be personal. All right, we're all in here because everybody likes college football, and let's try to clean it up a little bit and not go name calling. But let's move on to the next game of the day, right? And I think the next most interesting game is the Alabama-Arkansas game. And there's a lot you can take from that game, both positive, really, and negative. First thing first, Alabama had to get an onside kick to win the game against an Arkansas team that has had plenty of struggles. Georgia beat Arkansas 37-0, and Arkansas struggled in a lot of games. 23 points versus Auburn, for example. They lose to Ole Miss, and here Alabama could barely stop them. And so you start to wonder, this Auburn team that is currently losing to South Carolina, maybe just fumbled a punt to South Carolina. Are they a better defensive team than Alabama? And I think that's a realistic question that you've got to ask right now. But let's look at a couple things, right? Third down efficiency. Arkansas was 7 of 16. Alabama was 6 of 11. Arkansas on fourth down was 3 of 3. So one of the big things that happened in that game is when you have a high rate of fourth down conversions, it tends to keep a team in the game. Now, Arkansas had 468 yards of offense. They had 11.5 yards per attempt. Again, Alabama gave up big chunk plays through the air. That has happened for the third time really this year. And I think this is kind of who they are, but it's who they are in a sporadic sense. And so it's completely fair to be critical of them for not dominating the game, but it's also hard for me to take off so much about what they're going to do in the future. And I say that from more like if you were a bettor in a future game, or if you're doing a pick 'em, you've got to be really careful when you look at a game like this and say, well, if you can only beat Arkansas by 7, then you're going to lose to Auburn because Auburn beat Arkansas. That's just not the way college football works. And if you're Alabama, or you're looking at Alabama from a projection standpoint, there's actually a big positive here, and it's the obvious one. 559 yards passing and 112 yards rushing. Didn't run the ball very well against Arkansas, despite Arkansas being a team teams have run well against. But 14 yards per attempt is a crazy number. 14 yards per attempt, not just on a couple plays, but consistent passing the football. Bryce Young goes for 559 yards, sets the school's single game passing record, 31 of 40 passing, 5 touchdowns. I've talked a lot about the fact that for Alabama to beat Georgia, the thing they were going to have to do is find some rhythm on the offensive side of the ball such that they were going to be able to pass the ball vertically and, take some deep shots. I have no real confidence right now that Alabama can stop Georgia's efficiency game. But Alabama finding explosives in the passing game is something they have not been doing until this game. So for the future, in my mind, one of the big sort of question marks is, did Alabama just find rhythm and efficiency to where they can actually throw the ball against Georgia? So, when they play Georgia, look, it doesn't matter that they lost to Texas A&M. It doesn't matter what Texas A&M's wins or losses are. It doesn't matter how they played in this Arkansas game. And it's what Alpha Dog just made a good point. Like, Alabama's a team you don't really want to play, but not the best team. And I think that's what I'm getting at, right? It is fair to ding Alabama for everything they've done. It's fair to criticize them or to doubt them for a lot of it. But in a one-off game, I don't think they're as good as Ohio State, but they are capable of playing at Ohio State's level. I don't know if playing better, but defensively and offensively, they've shown better on defense. I think they're capable of playing with Ohio State and Georgia in a one-off scenario. I just don't know that you get it. So, I mean, my opinion of Alabama did not go up, but if you want to think of it this way, from where I had Alabama's defense, that goes down a rung and a half, but Alabama's offense in this game went up a rung. And so if you're talking about where Alabama is going to be versus Georgia, are you viewing them lower defensively, which I think you should, but now you start to think, if Alabama actually puts together their better defensive game and their better offensive game at the same time, what happens? And I think that just increases even further the volatility that we have going into the SEC championship game and the playoff game. And it really looks like right now that South Carolina is going to wrap this up and take out Auburn. So I'll probably flip over to the Utah game. Joseph L. asked a question regarding the Alabama game, and there's a bunch of playoff questions. If Alabama loses to Georgia, do they move to 4? Is there a rematch? A couple other people, Moshe Clark says, great show as always. What does the playoff picture look like? A Pucumber said, so Cincy might make this college football playoff. First, thanks for all the super chats, guys. We really appreciate it. Again, we don't put a lot of handouts out, and we appreciate your support. But I'm going to say something that I talked about on Twitter, riled a lot of people up on Twitter, but I think it's fair. And that's, pretty simple fact here. Oregon losing to Utah opens the door wide for a 2-loss Alabama to make the playoffs. Cincinnati is probably in, okay? So when Oregon loses this game, your top 4 contenders are going to be Georgia, Ohio State, Alabama, Cincinnati. The next best contender, somebody said, what's wrong with Oregon? Well, they're getting blasted by Utah, and that'll be their second loss, and with a bad schedule. After those contenders, your next best options are the 1-loss Big 12 champion, which I just don't think is going to happen because there's several avenues where the Big 12 champion could end up with 2 losses. Or you end up with Notre Dame. Notre Dame will be 11-1, will not play in a conference championship, and has already lost to Cincinnati, who is in the playoff. So, one hand, you've got the same problem. Alabama will have just played Georgia, but Notre Dame has already lost to Cincinnati. So, if Alabama loses to Georgia and Alabama, and then you start comparing Notre Dame to Alabama, well, Alabama ends up with 2 losses, but they were 11-1 in the end of the regular season, the same way Notre Dame was. Alabama's resume during the regular season is a lot more impressive than Notre Dame's, who ended up not having very many ranked good wins on it. They've had a lot of struggle wins. And so the committee ends up with this philosophical question that we've always been wondering: how are they going to deal with the reality of Notre Dame not being in a conference if they end up with a situation where Notre Dame's lack of a conference championship game gives them an advantage? Them not playing in a conference championship game means they don't have an opportunity to get a loss, where Alabama ends up, let's say, losing moderately close to the number 1 team in the country. Personally, I think it's extremely hard for Notre Dame to get into the playoff. I think a 1-loss if let's say Alabama loses. If Alabama loses to Auburn and then beats Georgia, they're still in. I'm pretty certain of that. And I'm not even sure a Big 12 team is going to get over them in that situation. I think 2-loss Alabama that is the SEC champion is getting in anyway. Then, if they lose to Auburn and beat Georgia. The next one you've got is the Big 12 champion. That's really the only one that's solid in there. I'm assuming Cincinnati's in, and then you get Notre Dame. If Cincinnati was to lose the AAC championship, which is something no one is talking about, and is a very realistic possibility. Man, I almost think if Alabama beats Auburn, they're in almost guaranteed at that point, because Cincinnati with one loss as a G5 and their schedule, it's already been reticent to put them in. And so if they were to lose to, I think it's Houston, they would end up playing. I think they're out. So people want to talk about chaos and they want to talk about playoff expansion. And I've said this 100 times in 100 different ways. Playoff expansion and chaos always favors the elites, because the elites play a harder schedule. They tend to dominate teams to a larger extent, but the things they do is they screw up sometimes. And so if you expand it, and like MGO Bosky just said, hey, Alabama, how about you don't lose 2 games? The problem is when you expand it, okay, don't lose 2 games, but who else are you going to put in instead of them? Because I'm talking about a scenario where there is no one-loss P5 champion out there left. You've only got 2. You've got Ohio State with a 1 loss. You've got Georgia, who's undefeated. And the only team, that's Alabama's second loss. The Pac-12 champion is going to end up with 2 losses if this Utah-Oregon game holds. I'm basically saying that I think the Big 12 champion is going to lose again. ACC is already out of it. And so everybody here wants to say, like, well, if a 2-loss Alabama gets in, then that's a travesty, and they're showing the bias of the committee. Who do you put in front of them? That is always our question. Who do you put in front of them in our top 10 rankings, in the playoff? There's no one left. The chaos of this year and everyone losing to everyone means that you run out of candidates to put ahead of them. And at some point, you got to put somebody in. And Alabama, just like 2017, Alabama did not deserve to be in the playoff in 2017. And in this scenario, they would not deserve to be in the playoff again. But my point is, you don't have anybody left. And like Crow King, anyone with one loss, there won't be anyone with a 1 loss, or not any P5s. Like, we're out of options here. So you end up with just a better resume. And like Joseph L is saying, why is everyone assuming Ohio State is beating Michigan? There are a bunch of things that can go wrong, and normally they don't. And in recent years, we have these scenarios all the time with a few minutes to go in the season. And by and large, the teams that are supposed to win always win. But, like Caleb Bowles, what about Oklahoma? Oklahoma hasn't beaten a ranked team yet, and they struggle with a lot of others. So do you think they're going to they have to beat ranked Oklahoma State, and then they're going to have to win the Big 12 championship game, which I believe would be Baylor at that point? They got to win both of them to be able to have 2 losses. So, a Pookummer saying only a deluded Michigan fan would say that Ohio State would lose to Michigan. I mean, it's extremely unlikely, which is why I wasn't really considering in my scenario. But basically, I'm saying if you stack up, let's say Oklahoma loses to Oklahoma State, or Oklahoma beats Oklahoma State, or what have you, the odds of you having that 2-loss team when the Big 12 go up. And then you have the possibility that Cincinnati loses the AAC championship. And then you have whatever small possibility that Ohio State loses to Michigan, or loses the Big 10 championship game. And I'm saying if you start adding all those possibilities up, Alabama once again is sort of sitting in the back door. And all this may be a moot point, but yeah, I mean, that's the reality of it, guys. And thanks to Blocko for the super chat. 6.14. I feel like that's probably meaningful, but I appreciate the love. So yeah, I mean, that's my takeaway. I think right now there are clearly two teams that are the best in the country. It's Ohio State and Georgia, and that's the truth of it. Our perspective on this, I think, has always been consistent. A 4-team playoff is usually more teams that are actually deserving. I think this year, with all the chaos, that's especially true. There are 2 teams in the country that look like they realistically can win a playoff. There are 2. Cincinnati, if they maintain being undefeated, I've held for a while, will deserve to be in the playoff given whatever else is done. Alabama is in the same boat. It's hard. Alabama and Georgia cannot both win out. But if Alabama loses, you will not have a 4th team. You will not have a 4th team that is clearly deserving of 614. 614 is the I know this. 614 is the Columbus area code. That just hit me. Oh, somebody else said it in chat. Yep. So So yeah, all right. Let's go back over next scores. I'm trying to just run through things, and if you guys, I'm trying to think here, anything. I feel like I've already beat this to get to death with Alabama and the playoff. More or less ranked teams versus 25, just right. I don't think you can rank more than 25. But yeah, I mean, the one thing I'll add to that Arkansas Alabama game was they hit all their. That game was mostly about deep shots and Alabama staying in it. That was a game where they had 3 points on 3 red zone trips. It's going to be interesting, and I think the Auburn game is going to be really telling, right? Is that an Arkansas team that put up 51 on Ole Miss, has only been held under 20 points, like, I think once this season? No, twice. They had a rough game last week against LSU, but that's a team that can put up points. Was this a situation where you get a fake punt for a touchdown, you get like 2 busted coverages? Like, how much does that translate in the future? I don't know. I thought Alabama was probably more unimpressive defensively than they were impressive offensively, but they did show more offensive production. They showed a lot more ability to attack vertically than I have seen from them at any point this season. So it's hard to judge them a lot further on that. That's enough on that topic. I feel like I've said enough. Mike Farino, appreciate the super chat again, no question. But you show up week in, week out, and I appreciate you guys showing up and supporting us. And if you have, I'm trying to keep an eye on things. If you guys have a question and you want to flag it, let me know. And I'll tell you, my wife is trying to help support me. If she sees a question that looks particularly interesting, go ahead and throw it in there, because I'm kind of running out of interesting things to talk about. But I will work on down to the next score. Utah and Oregon. It's the fourth quarter, 35-7 Utah. It's not just that Utah's winning this game, by the way. It's that Utah's dominating this game. Oregon looks to have a serious lack of physicality on the offensive and defensive side of the ball. That's what a lot of people had seen from Oregon throughout the year. That's why I haven't had Oregon very high in our top 10. And I mean, it is what it is. Like, I'll tell you the box score right now. If you're watching the podcast, I mean, this is just while it's in progress. Anthony Brown, 13-26. It's 50% passing, 7 yards per attempt. Travis Dye, one of the few guys in the country that leads his team in rushing and receiving. I think that's something they talked about. Has 1 reception and 6 carries. Like, they're not getting their playmakers the ball. Dye actually has 4.8 yards per carry, but it's in large part because Utah is shutting down what they do well and sort of taking away the rest. And on the other side of the ball, Utah is 10.5 yards per attempt, only on 16 attempts, but that does it. And they've got 3 ball carriers right now with 5 or more carries, all over 4.5 yards per attempt. I just don't think Oregon is a great team. I do think Mario Cristobal is doing a good job with that program. But personally, I think they're just not there yet. They need to get better on the trenches. I think they've got guys like Flo and Thibodeau, but they don't have a complete roster. And it's really guys number 20 through number 40 that determine whether or not you're going to be a playoff team. The lack of weaknesses and the lack of strengths across the board, that's what they don't have. And that's where, that's where they're going to have to improve to be a real playoff team. Somebody asked, like, is Michigan or Cincinnati number 4 on Monday? It's Cincinnati. Cincinnati's in ahead of Michigan. I know there's, like, people have a lot of sort of conspiracy theories that the playoff committee does rankings to sort of drive up numbers. Look, the playoff committee is a collection of athletic directors from each conference. If you're in talking about one of the teams to be selected, you have to leave the room if they're in your conference or you're affiliated with them. So no one's talking up their own conference. No one can push their team to be in. And importantly, yes, ESPN runs the post-game announcement show, but that's just a contract for them to interview the guy after they do it. They have nobody in the room. The playoff committee does not answer to them. They don't really care what ESPN thinks. And I say that especially because a lot of those guys are athletic directors for places like the Pac-12 and the Big Ten that don't have affiliations heavily with ESPN, or at least they're not necessarily the primary broadcaster. They're not going to jump Michigan over Cincinnati, especially given Cincinnati's emphatic win over what is a pretty darn good SMU team that is flirted with being ranked at different points this year. That was a very impressive game for Cincinnati, and I think solidly moves them into number 4. Bruce always showing up. I appreciate the love. saying you and me and Daniel are the best analysts, and he wonders if Ryan Day is going to actually try to drop 100 on khaki pants. Um, yeah, it remains to be seen. I made the point with Michigan State, and this is the one thing I'll say before we do our previews. Michigan State was almost a uniquely easy matchup for Ohio State. Where Michigan State struggled was where Ohio State excelled, and Ohio State was able to put tremendous pressure on that pass defense to the extent that it just really broke the game wide open. And Ohio State had no answer. And again, they got so, and a little bit like the Arkansas Georgia game in that regard, where Arkansas has been a good team all year, but they got down 21 to nothing, I think, in the first 5 minutes of that game. And it's just over because if you're a team that primarily runs the ball and you end up in a hole, everything goes completely off the rails. But look, I mean, Ohio State didn't have anyone get 100 yards rushing. And, Master Teague had 21 carries, and it was for 95 yards, 4.5 yards per carry. Henderson had one or two good runs, and then it was 63 yards. But the point there is, again, it didn't really shock me what Ohio State did on the offensive side of the ball. And so I'm a little hesitant to take that away and feel like that means they're just going to put up 80 on Michigan, because I think Michigan, on balance, is a much better defense than Michigan State. Michigan, on because their run defense isn't as good as Michigan State's, was a bad matchup for a Michigan team that can only really run and can't throw. So Michigan couldn't really exploit them in the way Ohio State did. It's just a different set of matchups. But the question should not be, will Ohio State put up 100? The question is Michigan going to, is Michigan going to be able to score in the game? And Joseph said $1.09, gave us a super chat and said this chat is toxic. Try to flag guys for me if you guys see someone toxic. We usually try to police it a little better, but it's hard to do that by myself. And I will encourage you guys, if somebody's being toxic, just ignore them or just flag them, but don't respond to people that are toxic. Couple other big things here. People talking about the $95 million man, Mel Tucker. I think this is an interesting point to talk about Mel Tucker, the contract, and maybe the possibilities for like the LSU coaching position or the USC coaching position. It's interesting. I think one of the big things here is people overestimate maybe the USC position and the LSU position to a certain extent. USC is not the same program they were. They have not invested in their facilities. They have not invested in their program. The talent isn't there. They're donors, but they just haven't been supported at an administrative or donor level to the extent that you might expect. And Michigan State is a better supported program, as most Big Ten teams are, than a lot of people realize. I think personally, it's not surprising from that perspective. Michigan State made the decision to lock him down. Look, the fact that he got blown out for Ohio State, I don't think reflects poorly on Tucker at all. I think personally, Tucker is dealing with the roster that he was given, and you can't fault him for just not having the Jimmies and Joes to be able to compete with in Ohio State right now. He hasn't been there long enough, and he doesn't have the guys. But what he's doing is a phenomenal job. And then when you look at the other jobs, I think it was like the talk was Lincoln Riley for LSU or all these other big names. Man, I'll believe it when I see it, because teams that are under active Title IX investigations or NCAA investigations historically have never gotten the guys that they want to get from a coaching staff perspective. They just haven't. And so I'm not surprised that Mel Tucker got that contract. It takes him off the board. And, you kind of go back to square one. I still think Fickle is probably the biggest fish in a lot of ways, but then you start getting down to Napier and others pretty quickly. All right. Keep on moving on. I think the next question a lot of people brought up, Scott Howard said, Heisman favorite after today. The question is, who do you think would vote for the Heisman, or who do you think I'm going to win it? My vote would probably leaning towards CJ Stroud because of how he's ending the year, honestly. Though what Bryce done, like Bryce Young sort of said, hold my beer with his performance against Arkansas, because he was absolutely not responsible for the fact that that was a close game. I think right now Bryce Young is your Heisman favorite, and I think Alabama's going to have two guys in New York with Will Anderson. It really is going to come down to the Georgia game, who wins the Heisman. Frankly, uh, Stroud is not going to have the opportunity due to their opponent to be able to prove himself to that level. That Georgia game is going to have every eyeball on the planet, and if Alabama does actually beat Georgia, Bryce Young is going to win the Heisman. If Alabama plays Georgia close and Bryce Young is very impressive, Bryce Young probably wins the Heisman. If Georgia dominates Alabama at the line of scrimmage, which is very possible given Alabama's offensive line, and Bryce Young looks bad, then I think C.J. Stroud wins the Heisman. The one other, and I think it's a massive dark horse, but it happened with Devontae Smith last year. If Will Anderson goes on a tear and he gets like 2 sacks a game in the next 2 games, or he dominates Georgia, which is not outside the realm of possibility given the way Georgia's offense is built, that Anderson goes off, I think there's an outside shot that he wins the Heisman. But I definitely think it's down to Stroud and Bryce by far as the most likely candidates. And Bryce, it's Bryce's to win or lose depending on that Georgia game. And that's just not really my take on it. It's just the way voters are going to look at it and how they respond. Stephen Light on the USC carousel gave a super chat and said USC has an administration that actually hates football. If you go there, you have to run the program as an athletic insurgency. The truth of the matter, he's not necessarily wrong. And that's a Penn State fan sort of talking about it right. Even in the depths of despair, Penn State had better systemic support than USC has provided their program. We've talked about that a lot on our channel. It's just, it just is what it is. So a couple people brought up like what happens if, let's say, Oklahoma State wins the Big 12 with 1 loss. I think they're probably in the playoff. The biggest question there is how do they compare to Cincinnati? And I think that's one of the more underestimated things. I think Oklahoma State has one of the clearest paths to the playoffs, but they're going to have to win 2 ranked games with a weak schedule. And those 2 ranked games are going to be Oklahoma, and then they're going to have to turn around and win the Big 12 championship with whoever they happen to play there. The problem for a lot of these teams, like Oklahoma State, their out-of-conference opponents were Missouri State, Tulsa, and Boise State. They did not play a P5 out-of-conference. In Boise State, they won 21-20. If you look at Oklahoma, right, their out-of-state competition was Tulane, Western Carolina, and Nebraska. They won the Nebraska game 23-16. And if you look at Baylor, and this has been pretty consistent criticism of ours with Baylor, they didn't play meaningful out-of-conference competition either. Texas State, Texas Southern, BYU. Now, the BYU win ended up looking pretty good, 38-24. It's probably the best of the group. But none of those 3 teams has an impressive P5 out-of-conference win. In fact, the only P5 out-of-conference team they played was Nebraska, and they barely won. And so it's, from our perspective, it's really fair to be critical of what any of the Big 12 teams have done, because all they've done is beat each other. And when you didn't play, like when you chose not to play in a P5 out of conference, and I don't care, you want to talk about the ACC or the SEC and, maybe playing eight conference games, the SEC teams are scheduling P5s out of conference and they're winning those games. The Big 12 doesn't even try. So Cincinnati playing like Notre Dame and playing Indiana, like at least they prove that they could hang with another major P5 team, and you make a comparison. The best we know for the Big 12 may well be that their champion might be slightly better than Nebraska, and they haven't really done anything to disprove that. So that to me puts them in a really, really rough position. So from here, I think maybe the one of the better things we can do is do like a top 10. Let me say one thing here, because Daniel just sent me a message. We're hearing chatter early today, and a lot of people may have already seen this or heard about it, that Mullen is likely out at Florida. We're starting to hear that. I don't think it's surprising. That that loss today to Missouri was inexcusable. Missouri is a terrible team. I thought Drinkwitz making fun of Mullen with the Darth Vader pull the hold up lightsaber, which means he stashed a lightsaber for that just in case he won, was the most ridiculous thing imaginable. But it just, and I think it was Bill Connolly that made the point. They had several opportunities to try to win the game, go for it on fourth down, try to kick a field goal when they got the ball, and they just didn't do so. And I think it's kind of embarrassing. And here's a super chat on it. Dan getting fired. It honestly feels like he's not even trying to win. And I don't know that with his ego or the ego of any coach that they actually try to lose, but it felt like he's just got, and I've always heard he's a really weird personality, gotten in this place where he said, I'm going to try to win the way I want to win, and I'm going to win with Emory Jones. And so, I think that stubbornness has kind of come back to bite him. I think it's turned into bitterness. I think it's turned into a refusal to admit that he's made mistakes. I was the first one to say that I didn't really think that Anthony Richardson was necessarily the best option. People were very critical of that, but you saw him as a starter. He was not effective. And you can blame Mullen for maybe not coaching him up. I think it's more right to blame Mullen for not finding an offense that fit his talents. But Mullen wants to run a scheme that's dependent upon being cerebral and making checks and, doing all these little things to where you can move the ball incrementally down the field in the spread. And he's just been unwilling to compromise or change or find a way to win the games they need to win. He's lost the locker room. He's lost the support of the administration. His recruiting is poor. I think if you keep Mullen another year, that team is going to be in really, really serious jeopardy of being set back for years. Because once that roster falls off, and that's the situation Florida State got in, right? Once the roster falls off and you have a bad coaching hire and you don't move on with it soon enough, you get buried. And on those terms, now Florida versus Florida State ends up being the battle for bowl eligibility. Generally, those are pretty tough games because players may not necessarily care about the bowls, but $500 in swag per player is pretty cool. They usually get a fun trip, and they care about that part of it, if nothing else, to be frank. And that game usually matters. But yeah, I do think it's probably right for them to move on from Mullen at this point. I don't think there's any way you can justify keeping him, and that's the thing that needs to happen. All right, anybody? If you give me just a second, I'm going to pull up and try to walk through. This is probably a massive mistake, but I'm going to try to walk through a top 10 live on this broadcast with you guys and think through it as I do it. Usually we do our top 10s. We think about it. We post them. In this case, because he's not here and I got a little more time, I figure I might as well walk through my top 10 and sort of let you guys know how I come about it or what the logic is internally. For me, the top teams are obvious. Georgia is number one. Their defense is obviously top tier in the country. I think I'm looking at BCF Toys to see the most recent ratings that he's published. BCFtoys.com. That's Brian Fremeau that does FEI. Great resource, great site. Georgia is third in the country in offensive efficiency. So not only are the top defense, and let me say, they're not just the top defense, they're the top defense that is rated twice as good as Alabama's in terms of, it's like 1.95 rating to 8.85 for Alabama, and then Ohio State is rated a 0.29. So their difference from the mean is twice as much as Alabama's is, and it's going to change a little bit with Michigan State, but still going to be about 4 or 5 times what Michigan State's is in that regard. So pretty crazy offense and defense. I probably don't give it enough credit as I should. They're aggressive. They get to the quarterback. They've got a really completely new set of guys in the secondary that just haven't been very effective. And I say very effective. They haven't been very bothered. Like they haven't been affected by the guys in the secondary, even though they've had injuries. They've had replacements from last year. Obviously, the Darian Kendrick transferring over from Clemson was a big deal for them at corner. But the linebacker play is Quay Walker and Nakobe Dean, some of the best in the country. They lose Adam Anderson. But they got guys like Nolan Turner to play there. They've got Jordan Davis. They've got Carter. I mean, it's absolutely loaded across the board. And they play well. They don't bust coverage. They don't look like Alabama, who seems lost half the time. And then on the offensive side of the ball, the big underrated point, if you look at points per drive, okay, so you take into account the pace that they run, points per drive, Ohio State scores 3.9 points per drive. Alabama scores 3.8. Georgia scores 3.6. 1, 2, and 3. Georgia, the only reason that their scale isn't their points aren't more is that they play more ball control and they don't limit you to a lot fewer possessions. But in every regard, Georgia is the class of college football, not just defensively, but offensively. They're a top 3 unit. And I think that's what Stetson Bennett's brought them, is a level of efficiency. And I think it's the most underrated thing in the country. Ohio State is number 2. They were the same way for me last week. I think Ohio State, and let me actually try something here if I can. Does this work? Number 2 is Ohio State. I think sort of kind of works. Doesn't really work. Number 2 is Ohio State. And same thing as last week. Their defense impressed me a lot more. I want to see it against someone other than a banged up Michigan State in a game where Michigan State's run game got taken away, because they're not a pass first team. But they could definitely solidify themselves on Georgia's level next week against Michigan, against what is a much more balanced defense. Maybe a more balanced offense, but I still have a lot of questions for them. Number 3, for me, it's still Alabama. I am concerned by the Arkansas game from them, but at the same time, I look at everyone past them, and everyone past them is somebody that could easily struggle with Arkansas when Arkansas is playing well. And Alabama's offense still is head and shoulders really better than what anyone else in the country's demonstrated, other than Georgia and Ohio State. In fact, I would say Georgia, Ohio State, and Alabama are the clear 3 in terms of quality, because their offenses are just so much better than anyone else's. They just really, really are. Michigan is my number 4 again. I'm going to keep them in that spot. Sort of sitting there quietly this week. I don't look. We're going to learn a lot about Michigan next week. I think it's fair to say that Michigan hasn't necessarily been super tested, but they annihilate Maryland 59-18. They've looked really good on both sides of the ball at times. Defensively, they look great. And so it's hard for me not to have them number 4. Cincinnati was very impressive today. Again, that was a good SMU team that they took to the woodshed, and we haven't seen that from Cincinnati in a while. So I think it's totally justified to have Cincinnati number 5. Right now, we're tracking the same as where I had been. Next one on the list for me was Oregon. They drop off entirely. The fact that they had beaten Ohio State and hadn't lost again. I always talk about how would you do with their schedule? How would you do with yours? I actually do give credit to someone that just wins if they're playing named teams. If they play in Ohio State and find a way to just win, and then they play down to their competition later, if you can play up and down to your competition, I do give you credit for that. My concern is when you see someone like Cincinnati that can barely beat teams that are good but not necessarily elite, and then play down a little bit. But one of the big things in Cincinnati's favor to me is I've got Notre Dame sitting there at number 6. Notre Dame has done nothing to fall off that list for me. And it, like Georgia Tech, 55-0. All they do is win. The last 3 weeks, they have given up a total of 9 points on defense. Now it's Navy, Virginia, and Georgia Tech, but Virginia's had a very effective offense. Georgia Tech is not an atrocious team, and Navy has put up points on people. I am extremely impressed with the job Notre Dame has done. It's gone really under the radar. I think Brian Kelly is one of the most underrated coaches in the country because of what he does with the recruiting restrictions they have. But the reality, and this gets into the playoff discussion earlier, I just don't think Notre Dame, from a quality perspective, is on the level of the teams above them. They're kind of the most consistent, best of the bunch below this point, but they can't really play with the teams above them. And again, if you want to talk playoff scenarios, Cincinnati's already beaten Notre Dame. And they didn't just beat Notre Dame. They beat Notre Dame 24-13. So you got a double-digit loss there. After Notre Dame, stuff gets really hard. To say the least, stuff gets really hard. And I know, and I'm going to check how they were struggling, but my tendency here, I've had this all year off and on, and people sometimes take issue with it. Probably Ole Miss. This Vandy game is 31-17, not exactly inspiring. 3:17 left in the fourth. But Ole Miss is a two-loss team. There are not that many of them left on the table at this point. They have wins against Arkansas. They've got wins against a close win against a decent Tennessee team, LSU. They beat Texas A&M, which is a big deal, 29-19, and they throttled people out of conference. That same Tulane team that gave Oklahoma massive issues, they beat 61-21. They beat Louisville 43-24, App State 54-17. So that's why I have them sitting at number 7. My number 8 is Oklahoma State. Oklahoma State, in my opinion, is sitting there with probably the best position to make the playoff quietly of all the remaining teams. And I think they're in a much better position than Notre Dame because they have the ability to beat Oklahoma next week and to win the Big 12 championship. This gets into what I was saying about Notre Dame. Like if Alabama has 2 losses or Oklahoma State wins with 1 loss, I think the committee is going to be extremely reticent to reward Notre Dame to go over anyone with the same number of losses that played in or won or lost a conference championship game. I don't think they'll care if you go into the conference championship game and lose if you had the same record going into it. And when Notre Dame's made the playoff like 2018, they were undefeated, and there weren't other undefeateds to go above them. Weren't the same number of losses coming out of the regular season. That's not the situation Notre Dame's in this year. And I think that loss to Cincinnati is going to be enough to keep them out. And I think Oklahoma State, I don't really have a lot more to say about them as a team. I mean, Spencer Sanders is a good quarterback. They're good on defense. I don't necessarily – there's not a lot that stands out about them. I kind of hate to say, but it's true. But they are sort of sitting there. Next one for me, I'm going to say my number 9 is Baylor. I wasn't impressed by their win over Kansas State. But again, you're sort of running out of options. All these Big 12 teams are sort of floating together. If you notice, Oklahoma's not in the top 10 for me. I don't think Oklahoma is as good as Oklahoma State or Baylor. I will do Bedlam, and I'll think more on it. But at the moment, it's hard for me to say that I think Oklahoma State is going to lose that game to Oklahoma, and then Oklahoma ends up at a 2-loss. Oklahoma could end up a 2-loss team with no ranked wins to end the year. And I think you kind of have to sit and question how much they were just the product of what ended up being a rather weak schedule, frankly, in terms of their ranking. But at this point, who do you rank where? I'm going to have to put Michigan State here. And it's tough for me between Michigan State and Texas A&M, I will say. And I know people are going to cry and cough about it because Texas A&M has some stupid losses, lost Ole Miss, Mississippi State, Arkansas. But, Michigan State has one of the easier schedules in the country outside of Michigan and Ohio State. They went 1-1 in those games. Then they lose a bad game to Purdue that they lose by double digits. I think that loss is just as bad as A&M's Mississippi State loss. And A&M's, A&M loses to ranked Arkansas, beats ranked Alabama, beats ranked Auburn, loses to ranked Ole Miss, has a bad loss to Mississippi State. They've played a lot more ranked teams. They've had a much harder schedule. They have one more loss. Because of the one extra loss, I'm putting Michigan State ahead of them. But I think it's a little bit of a crapshoot who you put ahead, Alabama or Texas A&M. And this gets to a point somebody just put in chat, Bama lost to Texas A&M. Crying face. Look, Texas A&M was unranked when they played. That was because they lost 2 straight after their starting quarterback broke his leg in week 2, and it took them a while to get things together. They are not a phenomenal team. They are absolutely no worse than Michigan State. I think if they played Michigan State, they would beat them straight up, and they are going to be a top 15 team this week. So, if they beat LSU, they're going to finish 9-3. And the funny thing is, and I've said this a couple times, all the crying about Alabama lost to Texas A&M, depending on how Ole Miss ends with Mississippi State, Texas A&M may end up being the highest ranked team on Alabama's schedule. So it's kind of ironic to me that the year Saban loses to an unranked team is the year that Alabama loses to the best team on their schedule by the end of the year. They're just inconsistent and have some offensive issues, but it's inconsistent because they have really bad quarterback play. not unlike certain teams in the Big Ten. So that's my top 10. Hate it or lose it. And if you don't like it, and I'm sure a lot of people like different things, you're free to tell me who you think should be in higher. But I'll tell you right now, if you go look at the list, there are a lot of 2 and 3 loss teams now that have to hover around the top 10. The pickings are really slim. And you got a lot of rivalry games to end the year. So you're probably going to have a lot more 2 and 3 loss teams sitting there around the top 10 by the end of the season. I certainly think the top 3 programs in quality are pretty clear. Your top 4 right now have to be Georgia, Ohio State, Alabama, and Cincinnati. I think Ohio State may jump Alabama this week, even in the playoff rankings. That'll be a very interesting thing to see. But I do think for sure Cincinnati is going to end up being number 4. And so there you go. There's my playoff rankings. That's the evening. Make sure I touch on any super chats here. I know someone gave me a super chat a minute ago, and see if I can scroll up without a comment. So that was really appreciated, Carrie Wilson. Oh, and she followed up with a question. So I want to try to represent that. I appreciate the further super chat. How much of Ohio State's defensive improvement do you think is due to scheme or youth? It's A and B. I think versus Michigan State, the scheme showed up more because that single safety scheme has struggled with modern approaches and modern offenses. It's too difficult for corners to cover in that regard. The RPO puts a lot of strain on secondary players to read, run, pass correctly, because if you start to bite on any of those run plays, you give up a touchdown. And you say, well, that's always the case in play action. Like, yeah, but you didn't see linemen releasing downfield on a play action pass. And so it's way more eye candy, and you can't key properly to be able to do that. So that's a big part of it. But the truth of the matter really is they didn't play consistently within even a basic scheme. They weren't tackling well. They were not getting any disruption at the line of scrimmage, which has started to show up. And we talked about that earlier. The players are definitely playing better. And there were some injuries at linebacker and things that had to be shuffled out. That happens with everyone. But yeah, it just sort of is what it is. Mark Blanton, why is Bama such a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? Defense has a great game one week and crap the next. I think the answer there is simple. The defense is inconsistent. Their offense has been pretty consistent. The LSU game was more than a bit of an aberration, but they lost their center in that game. Teams that lose their center usually struggle that game. It is very common for a team that has a center injured in a game to have a very bad offensive game. It throws up he's the guy that's done all the prep on how to do line checks. He's the guy that's responsible for cadence. He's the guy responsible for line calls, and it's usually hard to insert somebody new at that position and be really successful. But defensively, they're just prone to stupid busts. And what's interesting about that Arkansas score is you can look at that score, and it was certainly close, but it's kind of weird to parse from a quality perspective and in terms of what went wrong, because it's 35 points. 7 of the points come on a fake punt or field goal maybe, where the guy Alabama had in coverage read the play and the referee turned and ran into the Alabama defender. That's what happens if you go back and watch it. And the Arkansas tight end ends up wide open in the middle of the field, catches a one-handed pass and scores. It's a play that's real, but I'm not sure how reproducible that is. So it's hard to say that that's like a part of why they're Jekyll and Hyde. And then you look at the other 4 offensive touchdowns that were scored. I know 2 of them were busts by Josh Jobe, their corner. One, he runs into another secondary player. And then another one, he kind of just gets juked out of his shoes by Burks. Some of that's Burks being a phenomenal talent. A lot of people thought he was the most talented receiver in the SEC. I thought Butte was better, and I'm not 100% sure of how high on the pecking order he is, but he's definitely Arkansas's best receiver and definitely a high-round draft pick. And some of it was due to the fact that Jobe was playing injured, apparently. He was actually pulled after the second touchdown to Burks, and they put in a true freshman at corner. I'm sure he's a 5-star. Gabe Chinstry, so yes, he was a 5-star because he was heavily recruited. But they pulled Jobe because I think turf toe, I heard he was trying to play through. Didn't play a couple weeks ago. So is this a matter of, Arkansas had 7 possessions in the first half. Looking at it, that's a lot. They scored 2 touchdowns in 7 possessions, which isn't that much. have a couple busts, and then otherwise just sort of score once at the end of the game against Prevent. I mean, it's hard to put it together beyond just saying that Alabama has times where they have serious mental lapses defensively, and that's really the size of it. But that's why they're Jekyll and Hyde. And the offensive side of the ball, and I talked about this a lot earlier, they've generally been quite effective. I thought they've showed a lot more explosion tonight than they had shown, or this afternoon than they showed in any point this season, and that was a big shift. So, read through the last few comments, but yeah, guys, you got my top 10. You got my thing for the day, and I think you pretty well know where I'm at. Thanks everybody for tuning in. I see over 600. We look forward to talking to you next week. We're gonna have obviously previews for all the big rivalry games coming. This was a little bit of a slow week, but next week is going to be one more week of chaos, and I think you have to think there's a lot more excitement to come next week and the week after. The way the season's gone and the number of huge games coming up the next 2 weeks. I have a feeling whoever ends up in the playoff, and I already give them some scenarios or predictions on how I think it might go, probably not going to be somebody that we're all happy with. But I think at the end of the day, we're not going to have 4 teams that are all what we normally consider a deserving team. And that, you know, if you only got two lost teams left, then you got to put the 2 lost team in. So, yeah, that's what it is. Thanks everybody for coming in, and see you guys. Hopefully watch our videos next week, and I'll see you probably next Saturday night. Have a great weekend, guys. God bless.